The floor is yours, Steve.
The floor. Okay.
Floor.
Yeah, the virtual floor. Okay. Thanks, JC. Thanks everyone for coming this morning. Good to see everyone. As JC said, I am a graduate of UNSW and I visit very frequently. Unfortunately, I won't be visiting this winter, your winter, as I usually do. I wish I was there. Things are very much spiraling out of control over here. But in any event, let me start with my paper. So this is a very applied theory paper. I looked at the list. You've had a lot of very pure theory papers in recent times, or so far. This one's a very applied paper, so somewhat of a change of speed to what you've had before. It's on political economy. It's also a behavioral political economy paper to get even further from the pure theory papers you've had before. And it's about American politics in particular and the polarization that's happened in American politics. And as JC said, it's co-authored with him. It's been great fun working with him. And so let me jump right into what we've got here. We've got what we think is a simple story to explain a bunch of stuff. And so let me go through that mechanism. All right, so in case you're not familiar, what do we mean by polarization? So polarization is basically, in the US, is how the parties are moving apart from each other. And Democrats are moving further from the center, and in particular, Republicans are moving further from the center. So what this is a plot of is the distance between the parties in the US House and in the US Senate. And in particular, over the last 40, 50 years, this divide between the parties has really exploded. And it doesn't look like, at least up until now, doesn't look like stopping. To give you another representation of that same data, one that is a different look at it, but maybe more familiar to some of you, is to look at the ideological placement of individual House members on the right and senators on the left. The Democrats are in blue, the Republicans are in red, and these are just three snapshots over the last 30, 40 years. And what you see when you look at the data is these parties used to overlap in Congress, and over the recent decades, they've really just started to sort out and move away from each other. Such that now, if you look at the House in the bottom right, there's really no overlap. There's no overlap, and there's a gap between them. So there's been this dynamic process over the last 40 or 50 years where the parties and representatives of the parties have really moved away from each other. So that's the elite level polarization. We can also look at polarization at the aggregate, at the mass level of voters, of citizens. And so here the data is a little more ambiguous. At the elite level, it's very clear and uncontroversial. At the mass level, there's still some debates about how much polarization of voters has gone on. Right, but I think the conventional view, and what we're just going to take as a premise here today, is that there has been polarization amongst the voters. But what stands out about the polarization of the voters is that it began later than it did for the elites. It really only started to emerge 20 or so years ago. And up until today, it's been to a less significant degree. Right, so the polarization of the masses has happened. It just hasn't been as dramatic, and it came later. Right, so they're the two facts that we're going to try to pull out and emphasize in the talk today, which is that the elites and voters are more polarized today than they were 40, 50 years ago. And in particular, it wasn't just a sudden jump. It was this progressive movement that iterated over the years that took us from a much more moderate situation to the polarized situation that we're in today. Right, so when we think about polarization, what we're really wanting to be thinking about is not just the fact that these parties are further apart today than they used to be, right, but that there has been this slow iterative process over the last half century that has led us to where we are today. So when if we really want to explain polarization, what we want to do is not just focus on a polarized state versus a non-polarized state, but we really need to explain why are we polarized today, and why did the process look the way it looked over the last half century? Now, there's been plenty of people who have tried to explain polarization in the US. This is a big, prominent fact. People are very motivated and interested in it, and a lot of people have put forward theories. Many of them have failed and been dismissed, and there hasn't really been a standout theory that has worked to explain this. And one thing we think is that people are just sort of focused on why polarized today versus not yesterday. All right, what we're trying to do is explain both a more polarized state and the dynamic process that got us to where we are. All right, and so that's exactly what we're going to do. What we're going to do is propose a very simple mechanism right, in which we can explain both the progressive polarization of preferences and also the co-movement and the timing of elite and mass polarization. So we're going to try to explain why is it that the elites have gone from a much more centrist position to a polarized position, right? But at the same time and in the same mechanism, explain why voters have also polarized, but explain this timing as well. We're going to try to explain not only the polarization, but the fact that the voters began later than the elites and haven't polarized as much. All right, so it's not just a on-off story of polarization or not. We're going to try to match sort of the dynamic time series of this movement at both the elite and the mass level. All right, so that's what we're going to try to do today. It's going to be a pretty simple mechanism with some theory complication in there, but that's what we're going to do. All right, so how are we going to do it? Well, we're going to make one change. This is going to be our behavioral change. We're going to make one change to a canonical model of voting. Right, so we're going to take the classic model of voting that has been used for decades, just make one tweak to it, and then show how this can lead to a process that matches the data. Right, and the change we're going to make is a change that's pretty standard in other areas of behavioral economics. So the classic view of preferences of choices, you have your preferences, and that drives your behavior. Right? And your preferences are either fixed or innate or the driver of behavior. But what's been found in many areas of psychology and has been imported into behavioral economics is that the behavior itself drives preferences, and that there's this causal loop between these things. So what we're going to do is make a similar change to the voting behavior and to the theory of voting, the canonical theory of voting, and then trace through what happens. And there's plenty of empirical evidence for this causal loop, as I said, in behavioral economics, in psychology, but also for the change we're going to make. But this is a theory seminar, so I'm not going to get into that evidence. What it does mean is that within each period, behavior is exactly standard as it has been in every model for the last 70, 80 years. All right? So it's going to look very similar. Within period, it's going to match all the data within period. And what we're going to show is that this behavioral loop kicks in between periods, and that's what's going to drive things. All right, so we're going to make this behavioral change to voting, but that by itself is not going to lead to polarization. All right? On its own, this change could lead to polarization, it could lead to moderation, it could lead to no change in the electorate. All right, so on its own, this change doesn't generate polarization. The second key ingredient, well, the key ingredient for how this is going to work is what we're going to do is take this behavioral theory of voting, embed it into a model of repeated election with strategic parties, and then iterate. And so what we're going to show is that, in fact, it's this interaction of this behavioral effect of voters with the strategic competition amongst the parties that over time generates the dynamic patterns that match the data. Right? So it's this interaction that's really important to the process. And as I said, it's not going to just explain polarization, but it's going to show why not the elites polarize and the masses polarize, why the elites go first, and why the voters haven't polarized as much. And that's all going to just come out from this iterative process. All right, so basically the voters vote, the candidates compete, the voters vote, the voters update their preferences through this behavioral loop, even if it's very small. That changes the strategic problem the candidates, the parties face. They change their behavior, and this leads to this iterative loop. All right, and that's basically what the paper is going to be about. And so what we're going to do is show that voters in this model polarize as well as the parties, but only after the parties, but eventually they'll catch up. So when you say, well, what causes polarization? Our answer basically is it's complicated. All right, that once you add this behavioral element into voters, there's a story through this sort of interaction, this iterative loop between the behavior of strategic candidates and voters that's going to generate the patterns in the data. Right? So anybody looking at just elites or just masses or something like that isn't going to find this mechanism. All right, very good. So that's what we're going to do. Let me now walk you through how this is going to work. So first thing we're going to do is give you a theory of behavioral voting. All right, so what's the canonical model that we're going to take and that we're going to change? This is just the classic model of expressive voting with abstention. Right, so this was the original theory of voting that was put forward by Hotelling in his famous paper back in 1929 of sort of firms competing for customers. In that paper, he also pointed out that this is a theory of voting over parties or candidates in a spatial dimension. And so this theory of voting is very much like consumers buying ice creams. You stand up, you look around, you find the nearest ice cream seller and you buy from them. The same thing in voting. I stand up, I look around, I find the party closest to me, and that's who I'd want to vote for. Right? But if you're buying ice cream and the seller is too far away, you don't bother walking that far and you give up. Right? So the only people who buy from a certain seller are people who are closest to that seller and aren't too far away. The same theory of voting is that I like to express preference for the candidate that's closest to me, but if he's too far away, he doesn't excite me enough, and so I abstain. Right? So our theory of voting is exactly that. And this is thought of as expressive or sincere voting, and abstention is due to alienation. When I don't vote, it's because parties are too far away from me, and so I'm alienated from them. So formally, it just means that voters all have an ideal point in the space. Parties choose positions, as is standard, and the region of tolerance is given by lambda. So in other words, I'll vote for a candidate or a party if they're within lambda of my ideal point, otherwise I abstain. And if I vote for the nearest person. All right, so this is just sort of a classic view of voting. There have been other theories of voting that are put forward, some more rational. We don't think it matters too much to our result which theory of voting you use, but all we need is something like this, and all the theories of voting are consistent with this. And we're going to use this one because I think this matches up with the behavioral ideas that we're now going to add to that. All right, so that's how voters vote. You just vote for the nearest person, nearest party, as long as they're not too far away. And this is the standard, it's the classic model. You have your preferences, and that drives your behavior. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to add this, close the causal loop of behavior driving preferences. So what we're going to say is that the act of voting itself causes voters to change their preferences. So if I'm got my ideal point and I see Kim Sao there and he's my closest party, closest candidate, and he's within my region of tolerance, I vote for him. That's how I vote. And then what I do is I actually update my ideal point by moving it a little closer to Kim Sao. So the fact that I voted for him, I in a sense want to rationalize that vote and convince myself it was the right thing to do. And so the way to do that is to convince myself that he's closer to me than he was originally, and I move my ideal point a little bit towards him. In the paper, we'll tell a story about how this is essentially a generalized form of cognitive dissonance, that I want to, this is what cognitive dissonance says, I want to rationalize my choices when there's some sort of mismatch. But a sort of general form of it is that I just want to make my choices seem more sensible. And so the closer I am to Kim Sao, the more sensible it is to vote for him. And so maybe when I'm on the margin of parties, I need to move closer to him to rationalize that choice. All right, so the form of this updating, and this is what we're going to do to change the theory of voting, is just simply that everybody updates by moving a little bit towards the person they vote for. If you abstain, you don't update. But if you vote, you move a little bit closer to the person you vote for. And you move by this factor tau. So I take the distance from me to Kim Sao, and I sort of tau times that, and I move that much closer to him. Again, the form of this updating isn't that important. All we want is that the voters are moving towards their favored candidate. All right, so very good. So that's all we're going to do. All right, within the period, the voting is just the classic expressive voting. And then we're going to say between periods, voters update their ideal points in this way.
Just a quick clarification. Is there a lot of empirical support for this? I mean, in the United States, I'm asking because I come from a country where typically the opposite would happen, that people would be disillusioned and move further away. So another question would be, are the results robust if I move away from that point? And
I don't know, which country are you from, Alex?
I'm Romanian, and typically
Romanian.
when we vote something full of hope, and then it turns out to be not exactly what we thought it was, and we tend to move away from that.
Yeah, so there's lots of evidence in support of this updating structure in the US, in the UK, and in many other countries. What you're talking about is, well, now the candidate is in office, he or she has to perform, and when they fail to perform well, I get disillusioned and I move away. We're not going to have that performance in office dimension. I'm guessing that there's probably evidence for that as well. You know, as soon as everybody's fleeing Trump at the moment in the US, well, not everybody, that's the scary part, but many people are fleeing Trump at the moment. So that definitely happens, but that's an effect that's a distinct effect from what we're going for, from what we're trying to capture here. There's plenty of models of political economy where there's accountability, and I evaluate the incumbent's performance in office and I react to that. And I imagine the effect you talk about could be generated there. But this is very much, we don't have that part of political performance in the model, and this is just the act of voting. And I don't have evidence on Romania, but I would imagine somebody could find that.
No, thank you. I think the question was just to know for which country we know this is actually what's happening. And just as a technical question, sometimes it also works when you take the change in the opposite direction. And I was just curious whether you guys had a look at that. That's all.
We have not looked at that, no.
Could I,
Yeah.
I raise a question? I mean, the standard model seems to suggest polarisation as the norm. That is, you can divide the population up, go down. Yeah, there's a point in the middle. Everyone to the left of that votes for one party, everyone to the right votes for the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose, without wanting to commit myself to that model, it seems to me a lot of the problem with the US discussion is that the situation coming out of the New Deal, in which the Democrats were a coalition of racist Southern whites and other people, was an anomaly. It was far less polarised than it ought to have been. Mm-hmm. And that, but certainly from a theoretical point of view, why don't we predict polarisation from the start?
From the start, yeah. So the second point was there was certainly some sorting of party IDs in the 50s and 60s through the civil rights movement, but since then that realignment has sort of mostly filtered out, and now it's more just parties moving away from each other, and that's what we're trying to explain.
Sure.
Why don't we get polarization in the standard model? Well, the voters aren't updating. The polarization is meant to be their ideal points. And so if we start with some distribution, that distribution in the standard model isn't changing, and so there's no polarization of voters. And then we could say, well, given that distribution, and this is what we'll do in our first period election, the candidates compete. This could generate competition, and typically does, where the parties are very close to each other. And so it could generate a lot of moderation. And then if we iterated that model, nothing interesting would happen and there'd be no polarization at all. It would just be very stable. All right. So what we're going to do is show that this updating rule, even if tau is very small, generates this iterative process that's going to match the data. All right. So very good. So perhaps I see two hands up. Yes.
Sorry, quick question. It seems to me as though your model should lead to an increase in participation in elections. Is that so? And if not, is that the concern?
As we go through it, yeah, I'll show you that the turnout does increase in this model. And then we have I'll come back to that later. I think we can explain it by adding a little realism to the model at the end. And I'll talk about that. And we think that's very interesting. But you're absolutely right. The standard model, just working through this will lead to some increases in turnout, which isn't exactly consistent. Turnout hasn't really gone down like people think it has gone down, but it certainly hasn't gone up. But we'll explain. We feel like we can explain that.
Would you get an increase in polarization and a decrease in participation if the behavioral response was to move away from the guy in office if you didn't vote for him? Rather than
I don't know. Let me defer those sorts of questions till the end. Otherwise, I'll run out of time. There's lots of behavioral changes you can make. What we're trying to do here is say, here's one behavioral change that has empirical support, even though I'm not going into depths about that. And let me iterate this and show you how it matches the data. And as Alex's first question is, there's lots of other things going on in voters' heads that could change these predictions and lead to different predictions. Where we think it's sort of exciting that there's a lot of possibilities to go through here. Another question you might be asking is, well, in other countries, we have multiple parties rather than two parties, which we're going to have in our model. What happens then? Yeah, that's an interesting variation too. And I think that might lead to different polarization dynamics or not polarization. But let me kind of come back to those speculations more at the end. All right, so if we just run this model then and fix the party positions, so I haven't told you anything about party competition yet, just suppose we fix the party positions and then say, well, what happens? Well, as I said in the introduction, this change itself isn't necessarily going to lead to polarization. All right, if the parties are located, it just say the voters are distributed uniformly from negative T to T, and the parties are right in the middle of the right and the left wing block, right? Very moderate positions. And then we iterate, voters on the outside are going to move in towards the party position, voters on the inside are going to move out, and there's going to be no net change to polarization. We're just measuring it by the average distance from the center. There's going to be no polarization. There's compression of this distribution, but there's no movement at the aggregate level in or out. Right? Now, of course, if the parties start closer to the center and we iterate this process, there's going to be net moderation because there's more voters on the outside who are pushing in than there are voters on the inside who are pushing out. So if the parties are very close to the center and we iterate this process, we're going to actually get anti-polarization or moderation of the voters. Now, yep.
Are you able to say that the data are about polarization in the sense that you described and not in the sense of getting two groups that get distinct? Do we know that really?
I don't know. What do you mean by two groups distinct?
Are we sure that the average beliefs are moving away and not simply that they are concentrating in a bimodal way?
I don't understand what
voters.
The difference of that is. There's no beliefs here. There's just preferences. So I have an ideal point which updates.
Opinions.
And what we do know, or what we think we can infer from surveys and other evidence, is that distribution of preferences is moving into a more bimodal distribution.
Yeah, more bimodal. More bimodal is also consistent with the previous diagram that you just showed, the previous slide, right?
Yeah, well, it's more bimodal, but it's also the data I gave you earlier is distance between these groups. All right, so it certainly seems to be that the distance between the elites is increasing and the distance between the voters is increasing. So yeah, you're right. If the parties are moderate and everyone's compressing, they'd compress around 2 points and we'd have a bimodal distribution. But what we do find is that bimodal distribution, it's the mean of Democrats and Republicans is moving away from each other. But that's what the data.
I mean, that's consistent with sorting. That's the problem, I think, is that the picture you showed doesn't distinguish clearly between sorting and polarization. If you had a bunch of people who, for arbitrary reasons, voted Democrat or Republican, and then people started paying attention to politics and realised that they were actually Democrats and actually Republicans, you'd have that same picture in terms of the red and blue thing. So what you need to do is show, which I think clearly is true for the elites, that the total distribution has moved to being bimodal rather than merely that the two parties have moved apart, or at least they're two different notions of polarisation doing that.
Yeah, so the empirical political science literature is just sort of a crazy, well, I shouldn't say crazy, it's sort of this mass of people arguing exactly those questions. And so that's why I said early, there's a little controversy about exactly what's happening with the voters and whether it's just sorting, whether there's true polarization, whether it's an anomaly in the data and that it's not really there. I'm just going to there's plenty of people in that literature who think it's this and argue that it's this. Everyone seems to think it's at least in part this. And my reading of the literature is that there is some sorting, but it's not as much sorting. I'm just going to take it as given and run with this and then show you I can explain that. And then if this allows me to come up with some comparative static that allows me to go back into that debate and say something useful to help them sort it, that would be great. But I'm going to take it as given. All right, very good. So that's if they're moderate. Now, of course, if the parties start really extreme and we let voters update, it's again bimodal, but they're going to, the bimodal distribution is the average voter is going to move away from the other group, and we're going to create polarization of this sort. All right, so, and of course, if we just fix the party positions, we're not getting any elite polarization here either. All right, but what I want to convey in this slide is that on its own, this update doesn't cause polarization. It's not just like we can say, oh, look, let's the part voters update and this guarantees polarization. It all depends upon where the elites are and what they're doing. All right, so what I want to do now is to take this tweak we made to the voter theory, embedded in a model of strategic parties, and then show how this back and forth between elites, between the parties and the voters generates the time series that we want to try to explain. All right. So very good. Let me add strategic parties. So what we're going to do is add a very, very standard, well, I shouldn't say too standard, but a very conventional style model of electoral competition. There's going to be two policy motivated parties, D and R, the Democrats and Republicans, and we're going to add some uncertainty in the spirit of Calvert and Whitman, for anyone who knows that literature. And there's been many papers that have looked at this in the interim. All right, so there's two parties, D and R, that have ideal points on the left and on the right. They're just fixed. Maybe they should be updated over time as well, but let's take that as fixed for the moment. And their positions in each election T are given by lowercase dt and RT. And I should say we're going to have an election in every period T1, 2, 3, and so on. All right, so everybody who studies these models, pretty much, they're all static or one-shot models. We're going to do it in a one-shot and then iterate over time. All right, so the utility of the parties is going to be linear based upon the policy, so each of them is going to announce a policy in each period. They're committed to that policy. That's the lowercase d or r. And if they win, that gets implemented. The utility of the parties then is how far is that implemented policy from their ideal point? And if they win the election, they get a boost beta for just winning the election. All right, so the linear utility is a little of a restriction, but otherwise, the shape of this model looks very similar. Now, as I said, pretty much every other model is a one-shot model, so they don't have to worry about dynamic preferences. We've got a dynamic model, so the parties, in principle, should care about their utility stream over a longer horizon. We're going to shut all that down because it gets complicated, and we're just going to assume that these parties are myopically optimizing their policy outcomes and their payoff in each period. We don't need dynamic incentives for the result. We sort of sketch and conjecture that, and the intuition certainly points to the fact that if they had longer term incentives, longer term, longer horizon, this would only magnify the degree of polarization. But it does make it intractable. So very good. So that's the parties. That's how they're going to compete. Pretty standard. Now the voters. So the voters are going to have the preferences and the updating like I gave you a few minutes ago. All right. In the model, we're going to have two sets of voters. One is going to be issue voters who do exactly what we've just spoken about. So they're going to have there's going to be a distribution of ideal points of those voters. We're going to assume that's distributed logistically because it allows us to get closed form solutions. So there's a standard usual single peak distribution of voters who are going to do exactly what we just spoke about. On top of that, we're going to add a second group of voters who we're going to call noise voters. These are just akin to noise traders in finance. All right, so we want to add some noise to the model, some smoothness to the model. We're just going to assume there are these voters who vote randomly and smooth things out. All right, again, there's some empirical evidence that that's not a bad way of describing the electorate anyway. All right, the usual, so let me say, and then we're going to assume that these noise voters are distributed in such a way that the winning probability of each party is just going to equal its share of issue voters. All right, so with somewhat of a reduced form way of doing this, but we want to add some smoothness to the model, and we're just going to do it this way. So whatever fraction of issue voters you win, that's your probability of winning. All right, so why do we do two types of voters? Well, all of these literature, starting with Calvert and Whitman, you want to have some smoothness in the model. Usually what they do is they add the noise to the issue voters. Right? If we were to do that, it's going to cause a lot of difficulty because we do it dynamically, and that we're going to try to update and keep track of the noise. It gets a huge mess. So what we're doing is basically just separating out the noise from the ideal points. Right. I think it's pretty fair enough. All right, so we have some technicalities in these models. I'm not going to get into it too much, and you can harass JC afterwards if you've got questions or you're interested in this. But basically, these models of elections have, even in one-shot models, have existence problems. And the existence problems come from the second order condition. We can solve for the first order condition, but then it's not usually the case, or it's difficult to ensure that that first order condition is in fact a global optimum. Basically the parties are out here, it's hard to prove that they don't want to jump to the center, and that's not better for them. So there's some issues of existence, which drives the way we've set up the model. And in fact, we're making that more complicated because we're going to add abstention to these models. Turns out nobody studied these models of Calvert-Whitman style with abstention. And we're going to show that matters in an interesting way. but it complicates the analysis because now we're going to have some kinks in the payoff function, which makes it a bit messy. But in any event, we're able to overcome those technical problems. In a way, the logic of the model is very simple, but this first period equilibrium was a challenge to resolve. But we're able to pound through. JC was largely able to pound through this model using hyperbolic functions, and then we can show that this payoff function is, or the vote share function is log concave, and we use that to show uniqueness of the optimum. We can do that more generally. The logistic allows us to get the closed form solutions. All right. Very good. So let's jump in to see what the equilibrium is. So we're going to solve for the equilibrium in the first period. This equilibrium is very similar in logic to anyone who's familiar with these models. And to anybody who's not familiar with the models, it's got an intuition that exists in many different models of economics. All right. So basically, for the parties, their problem is if they move closer to the center, they're more likely to win the election because they're closer to the median voter. But if you move in, the policy isn't as attractive to you. So basically, they're trading off the margin and the inframargin. It's like, I move in, I've got a better chance of winning, but if I win, it's not as appealing. And so basically, the equilibrium is these parties are moving in towards the center, and eventually they hit a point where they're happy to stay where they are because the other party is close enough to them that losing to the other party isn't as costly when they get in. And so the gain of winning the election isn't as significant because if you win, you're moving the policy from the other guy to your position. Right? So the benefit of winning is a function of how far apart the parties are. All right, so that's the usual trade-off in these models. And as I said, we're adding a complication to this in that we're adding abstention. Right? And the abstention changes things because now if I move in and win more voters in the center, I'm actually losing voters on the flank because the voters on the flank, on the fringes, are getting further away from me and some of those roll off. And so as we are moving towards the center, we're winning more votes in the center, but we're losing some on the fringes. And so abstention is going to weaken their incentive to converge toward the center. All right. So what does the equilibrium look like? Well, the important thing is we prove that there's a unique symmetric equilibrium where the party R is on the right, party D is on the left, and their solution to that equilibrium is given implicitly in these complicated functions. All right. And what we find is that there's basically two cases depending upon the size of this lambda. All right. So there's a unique equilibrium and the sort of cases depend on lambda. And the cases vary or differ, I should say, based upon whether there's abstainers in the middle of the distribution or not. Right? So if I'm on the left, I'm winning voters a little more extreme than me and a little more moderate than me. And the same for the guy on the right. But there might be people in the middle who are too far from either party that they abstain. So the two cases differ based upon whether when the parties stop converging, whether there's still abstainers in the middle or not. And what we find is for lambda smaller than lambda upper bar, that's the case. And this is the picture in the upper left. The parties kind of converge. They each win an interval of support around them. There's abstainers on the flanks, but there's also an interval of abstainers in the middle. Once lambda crosses this threshold, lambda upper bar, the pressure to converge is sufficient, or in a way, the size of the interval of support is big enough that they bump into each other in the middle, and such that there's no abstainers in the middle of the distribution. All right. So they're the two cases. If you're into these models, this is actually, I come from political economy. This is an interesting result in that sense, in that this is the first time anybody's identified an equilibrium like this where there's abstainers in the middle. All right? So basically what we show is that this convergence stops before the parties start competing head-to-head in the middle. Right? In every existing model, the idea is they sort of are both competing for the median voter right at the middle, and the competition is to see whether the median voter votes for the Democrat or the Republican. What we're showing is that for lambda values that aren't too big, that doesn't actually happen. Each of the parties win an interval of support on the flanks, and the guys in the middle, particularly the person who's indifferent between the parties, is so alienated that they don't vote for either one. Right? So we get this convergence to stop before they hit each other. All right, so this is a sort of big question in political science, which this is a theory seminar in Australia. You guys probably are not plugged into, but there they talk about, should parties battle to win the median voter, or should they focus on turning out their base? Right, what this equilibrium shows is that these are really just different parameter values of the same equilibrium. All right? The size of the lambda determines whether whether it looks like they're just mobilizing their base, or whether it looks like they're competing for the median voter at the center. All right. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to iterate this model in a few moments, and we're going to show that this left case, where they're not competing for the median, is in fact going to be the generic case in later elections. All right. What time we got? 7:36. So what does this equilibrium actually look like? Those equations are not so difficult to interpret. What we've plotted on the left is the equilibrium location for party R. My figure isn't very well labeled. For party R, given as lambda varies. And the three curves are for different values of beta. So beta is the extra bonus you get from winning the election. All right, so what we find is that as lambda increases, the equilibrium locations of the parties are not monotonic in lambda. For small values of lambda, the parties diverge as lambda increases until they hit this critical threshold of lambda star. Well, actually, it was lambda upper bar on the last slide. Sorry for changing notation. It was lambda upper bar. And then after they cross that threshold, they begin converging again in lambda. All right, very good. And those different values, the most polarized, the furthest position is for beta 0, beta 1, beta 2. All right, so this, on the right figure, this depicts the different regions of turnout and abstaining. So for lambda close to 0, the parties are at non-centrist positions, and each of them wins a very small interval around them. There's abstainers in the middle and there's abstainers on the flank. And as lambda increases, the parties change position, their interval of support increases, and eventually we don't get abstainers in the middle. All right, very good. So making good time. So that's the first period equilibrium. Does anyone have any questions at this point?
So I have a small question. So you are assuming that both of the parties care equally about winning and losing, moving away from their ideal points. So suppose one of the parties care more about staying close to its ideal point. Do you still expect to have like a unique equilibrium in that case?
We don't know. Maybe JC can answer that one later on or in the chat. The symmetry helps us solve this first period equilibrium. Everything's going to be symmetric in what I talk about. We have extensions in the paper to deal with this asymmetry, but how do we handle that one? It's just proving existence of the first period equilibrium is difficult. I can't remember if we figured that out.
So we can handle different asymmetries in how much parties like to win the election. So we can have different beta coefficients. Okay, Republicans like to win the election more than Democrats, and we still can prove uniqueness of equilibrium.
I see. Okay, yeah, I guess it's isomorphic to the case where if they have the same betas and one cares more about staying close to the point, it feels like it's like a very similar case, just change of the rescaling of the parameters, I guess. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so this matters because I didn't get into the data. The data is that the Republicans have polarized to a greater degree than the Democrats, that it isn't symmetric polarization. And so we want to be able to explain that sort of asymmetry at some point. We also explore different, suppose the Republican voters update a little bit more and show how this can generate asymmetric polarization. All right, very good. Yes.
Steve, sometimes we hear people saying that Donald Trump moving more to the right in order to drum up the base. There's nothing intrinsic in your model that when the party need to drum up the base, they will polarize, right? Can we make sense of those statements that we usually?
Yeah, so that's right. So in our model, the parties are just trying to get as many people to vote for them as possible, and everybody votes I shouldn't say that. They're trying to maximize their utility, and they're moving around to increase or decrease their vote share accordingly. And every voter votes the same, and they all vote mechanically based upon this distance. And so you're right, there's nothing in the model to say I'm choosing a strategy of mobilizing the base, or I'm sort of doing anything different in that way to turn out the voters. It's all very mechanical how the voters respond. When I made that claim before about distinction between mobilizing the base and competing for the median, what I'm trying to do is exactly what you say, sort of make sense of these statements that the empiricists talk about. I think what we're trying to say is that if you just sort of take these two equilibria, one where their intervals are meeting in the middle and the median voter tosses a coin as to who to vote for, that looks very much like the case of parties sort of moderating and competing for the center. Whereas the second equilibrium, where the center is abstaining and just people on the right vote R and people on the left vote D, looks a lot more like a mobilize the base strategy. And so what the point we're trying to make is sort of just point out that a lot of the data that motivates these sorts of statements actually can just come out of a mechanical model in this way. And that really it's just different shape, different location of the equilibrium for different parameter values. I'm not equipped, I think, to try to go further into making sense of the empiricist claims, but what we do think that it's just sort of a nice, if you're going to say that it's mobilizing the base, you then need to explain something beyond what comes out in this equilibrium.
Thank you.
All right, very good. So now we're going to iterate the model. All right, so that happens in the first period. We could have written a paper with a first period of election and abstention, and that could have been our main result, that you get an equilibrium where there's abstainers in the middle. Right? But what we're doing is going to use that as a tool to then try to get at polarization. All right, so now the voters update, and this is where things get, in a way, tricky for voter behavior, because what happens is everybody who votes moves towards the party they voted for, and everyone who abstains doesn't. And so what does that look like? Well, here I have a picture of the logistic distribution where for the case where there's abstainers in the middle. And after they update, of course, the distribution of ideal points changes. And in particular, there's now 4 gaps in the distribution. The green and the orangey line are the voters. They all update. So in a sense, their density compresses and increases. And a gap opens up between them and abstainers on the flank and towards the middle. Right, so that's what happens when there's abstainers in the middle. They update, and so now our distribution of voters looks like this. And this is a much more sort of unfriendly distribution to work with. Right? But that's what's going to happen to the distribution. If there aren't abstainers in the middle, of course, then gaps open up. There's now 3 gaps. There's 2 gaps on either flank, and then there's a gap in the center between the two parties. Right? And this is the distribution of voters. And so this gap opens, in this case, this gap opens up in the middle. And there's about the missing, in American politics, about the missing middle or the disappearing center of the electorate, that this center is hollowing out. Right? So we're showing here this come up, this hollowing out of the center. All right, so that's what happens. But now we want to say what happens to the strategic problem of the parties. And so now we're going to iterate. Now we're going to send the second election. The same parties have to compete for election, and now they've got to compete over this distribution of voters rather than the smooth logistic we had in the first period. All right, so what's going to happen? Well, the key idea here is, it's perhaps not hard to see, is that once you have this gap in the distribution, this is going to change the strategic incentives of the parties. All right, so now we're used to thinking of the parties competing for the median. The idea is I move in a little bit, I then win the median, and I win 51% of the vote, you win 49%, and that's why I do it. Now that there's a gap in the distribution, moving in a little bit isn't going to win you any more voters in the center because there's no median voter there to win. Right? So you're not going to converge anymore. At the same time, diverging, moving out, isn't going to cost you any voters because there's no voter at the center of the distribution to lose. Right? So what's going to happen is this sort of competitive pressure to compete for the median, in this case, right, is going to disappear because there's no median voter there. All right, so what's going to happen is I'm going to iterate out a little bit because moving out doesn't cost me any voters and I might as well get a better policy. You're going to do exactly the same. Right? Now the cut point between us is again at the center of the distribution. So again, I can iterate out a little bit. You can iterate out a little bit. And so this equilibrium in the first period is going to unwind because of this gap in the distribution. This gap can be arbitrarily small. You could update by tau, a very small tau, and this sort of unwinding of the equilibrium is going to kick in. Gabriella, you have your hand up.
I didn't mean to.
Okay. You were just high-fiving me. All right, very good. So this gap opens up, and so this competitive pressure to converge is going to unwind. All right? This is basically the inside of the paper. This little bit of updating of voters is significantly changing the strategic problem of the parties because now they can unwind towards their ideal point. Now, of course, you can't, what's going to happen is this iterative process could lead to loads of unwinding where they go all the way out to their ideal point. Right? But then we'd explain polarization, but it would be basically bang, bang. In the second election, you would go from a very centrist position to an extreme position. What's going to constrain the parties from iterating entirely in the first period is not that they're competing against the other party for the median voter anymore, but what's going to happen is if you start polarizing too much, you're going to lose your own voters that are near the center. Right? So eventually, even if the distribution updates a little bit, if you move too far out, your own voters are going to start the people who voted for you in the first election and updated towards you are going to abstain because you're too far away from them. So the strategic effect is not that I'm competing against the other party, but I'm competing against apathy. I need my voters to turn out and support me. So I can update a little bit, but if we start polarizing too much, we start losing voters in the center. Right? So the challenge for us in the second period is characterizing what does this equilibrium look like. And our result is going to show that both parties follow what we can call a no voter left behind strategy. So you move out, but you move out just enough such that the marginal guy who voted for you in the first election is still the marginal guy in the second election. So you don't lose any voters to abstention. Everybody who voted for you in the first election and moves out a little bit, you polarize just enough such that they all still vote for you in the second election. All right, and so the sort of restraint on your polarization is the abstention margin towards the middle. Now, I forget who asked the question earlier, but yes, as I move out, I'm also gaining voters on the outside. So my turnout is actually going up a little bit as we do this because I'm not losing any on the middle and I'm gathering voters on the outside flank. And so that's what's going to constrain polarization and make it iterative. Now, we've got to prove that's an optimum. And the way we prove that is use the condition from the first election. All right, so the fact that that was the marginal voter in the first election and that was your optimal position, we can also use to show that that's the optimum thing to do in the second election, that you don't leave that guy behind. Sven Feldman.
Yeah, just real quick. The intuition for me doesn't quite work that you're not leaving any voters behind, because there's obviously only a first order loss if you lose some, but at the same time, you also have a first order gain in moving towards your own ideal. So there should be a trade-off where you leave some, the outermost edge of the voters behind.
Yeah, so the way it works is in the first election, if I moved out, not only I left them behind, all right? Now it's the same margin. I'm leaving exactly the same guys behind, and they're denser now because they've squashed in a sense. And so I'm sort of leaving more behind now. I'm gaining fewer guys I'm gaining the same fraction of guys, the same measure of guys on the flanks because that distribution of abstainers hasn't moved. Right? And it's now more costly to me to lose the election to the other guy because he's further away. And so you put those pieces together and it's sort of strictly positive. It's strictly optimal to not keep moving. Right? And so that by this dominance argument, we can show that if the equilibrium in the first period means that you don't leave any behind in the second period. Right? The interesting twist is, so we can prove using the first period equilibrium that that's the optimal thing, but you might be sitting there saying, well, that's assuming that I'm going to move to the outside. Maybe I could do the same thing and move to the middle. Right? Now, that's not going to be a good strategy when there's a gap in the middle, when there's a gap in the middle of the distribution, and I have the wrong distribution there. But when there are abstainers in the middle, this might be positive. This might be optimal to do because now I can move in and I win more voters in the middle, but I don't lose any on the outside because there's a gap on the outside flank. Right? So it turns out that that's a good thing to do as well. All right, and so in fact, what we show is that this payoff function in the second period has multiple peaks. We lose all the nice properties of single peaked payoff functions, and that there's a local optimum to go into the middle and not leave any voters behind on the flank. Right? So it's sort of utility increasing to move in as a result of this updating. It's also utility increasing to move out as a result of this. And what we have to do is use the dominance argument to show that moving out dominates moving in. All right? And so that's how we're able to prove that this is the equilibrium, the optimal equilibrium in the second election is to unwind, but unwind just enough such that you leave no voters behind. Very good. So that's
I guess Swan's question probably, I guess your answer probably hint on the fact that the loss from deviating from the elite ideal point is linear. If it is, I cannot immediately think quickly, but if it is concave or convex, probably the marginal gain of moving towards the elite ideal points probably would change.
Yeah, that marginal gain changes. We thought through that. We think it's fine if you have the usual sort of non-linear structure on this, as long as you have risk aversion there. I think it works fine because yeah, I think it works fine. But let me not try to remember the details now. Very good. Yeah, so basically, in some, what it does rely on is that there's this single peak distribution at the start. If it wasn't single peaked at the start, this logic may go differently. But basically, you're sort of dragging more voters with you than you're losing, than you're gaining on the flank. Very good. So through these two dominance arguments, we can show that moving out is better than moving in, and that the optimal amount to move out is exactly this no voter left behind strategy. All right, so we're going to deal with our two cases. So with low lambda, when there's abstainers in the middle, this is pretty simple. You just move out tau times lambda, because the marginal voter updates by tau times lambda, and that means you can move out by tau times lambda to leave that guy indifferent. All right, so in the second election, in that case, you move by tau by lambda, and I explained that. In the high lambda case, you can move out even more because you were competing in that was the case where you were competing intensely for the median voter. And so what that means is when the guy updates by tau by lambda, you actually have some slack in your region of tolerance. He doesn't start lambda away from you, and so you can unwind a little further before that guy's indifferent. So in this case, when they compete more intensely for the median voter, we get more unwinding in the second election, or more polarization in the second election. Right? But in both cases now, the situation is that the parties aren't competing for the same voter in the middle. All right? So that case where the parties are competing intensely for the median happens in one for high lambda in the first election, but by the second election for all lambda, they're both just basically winning their own base of voters, right, and moving out with them. And so what we're going to do then is just iterate this. And what happens is you have your set of voters and you're just sort of moving iteratively towards the extreme, dragging those voters with you. All right. There is an extra case here that we can have equilibrium failure here. If lambda is large and tau is small, we can get a problem with our second order condition. So basically this says if there's a little gap, the removal of competition over the median voter can lead us to unwind a whole lot. But then if we unwind and polarize a real lot, it's optimal for one of these guys to jump to the middle and win again. So this can fail if tau is small and lambda is very large. Very good. All right, so then we just iterate. So in the third election, the same thing happens, and they polarize by this amount lambda tau. All right, so you'd leave no voter behind. So the voter updates by lambda tau, you drag them by lambda tau towards the extreme. All right, so what does elite polarization looks like? Well, it's just going to have a pattern of some structure like this, where the parties start, and we can set the parameters to get them as close to the middle as we like. And no matter where they start, this iterative and smooth process carries on until they get to their ideal points, and then they stop. The kink in the rightmost figure is this second election effect, where you can unwind or polarize more in the second election, but then it slows down to lambda tau. Right? So the polarization of the elites is very monotonic. It's very smooth. They just keep going until they hit their ideal point. Right? What happens to the voters? Well, here's a somewhat sort of crowded figure, but hopefully you get the idea. The black line is the polarization of the party, which is the figure I just gave you. This is for party R. Party R starts at R1 star, and it just polarizes out until it hits its ideal point of capital R and stays there. Right? So what's going to happen to the voters? Well, all the voters who voted in the first election compress around R, but as they're compressing, R himself is moving out, and so that sort of distribution shifts and chases R to the extreme. All the voters on the inside are moving out with the party. All the voters on the outside are sort of moving in, and they move in until they cross over the party position, and then they reverse and chase the party out. Right? So what's this going to mean is that this means the voter polarization is happening later than the elites. And in fact, in the first periods, the voters can be moving towards the center. If more of them are on the outside, they're moving towards the center, and it's not until the party crosses them that they reverse and start chasing the party. So what this dynamic explains is two things: why the voters are polarized less than the parties, because basically they're chasing the party out, so they're always behind the party. And two, why they started later, because initially they can move into the party, and it's only after the party gets sufficiently polarized do they reverse and start chasing the party to the extreme. All right, so we think this is explain this sort of different parts of the data. The elites are polarized. They're polarized more than the voters. The voters started later than the elites and haven't polarized as much. But if you trace this model on, what's going to happen, of course, is the parties stop at their ideal point, and eventually the voters keep polarizing until they're just as polarized as the elites, and they all compress around their ideal point. So our read of the data is that we're just not there yet. The fact that voters aren't as polarized as elites just means we're 3/4 of the way along this process rather than all the way along. And so the prediction is that the parties will keep going until they hit their ideal point. The voters will chase them, and eventually they'll get to the same position as them. Very good. So this leads to some other facts. Let me skip a couple of these. What I wanted to tell you is just, somebody asked about turnout earlier, but mostly what I want to tell you is just in my last couple of minutes is a sketch of how we might extend this to not only address the turnout issue, but I think to say some more interesting stuff. So this polarization has happened for the last 40, 50 years, and we've explained that dynamic. You might be asking, well, why are we sort of starting 50 years ago? What happened before then? All right, why can't you explain what happened before then? Well, you know, we can't explain everything, but I want to try to talk a little bit about what happened before then and what might happen. All right. And this is the figure I gave you earlier, and I cut off the left side. All right, and so basically the fact is the parties used to be polarized 100 or so years ago. They moderated into the middle of the 20th century, and then they polarized after that. So rather than this monotonic polarization, it's really more of a cycle of at least one cycle: start extreme, come in and go out. And I've started in the middle of this graph and explained from there going forward. So you might say, how can we explain all of it? Well, this gets beyond the tractability of what we can do. So I'm just going to talk a little loosely in my last minute or so. Right? What you would want to say is, well, let me say, what I want to change to the model to explain this is I want to add births and deaths. So we've assumed a fixed population, but this model has gone for 50 years. So in practice, over 50 years, all the original voters are dead and there's new voters arriving each period. Right. So suppose you just had a model where new voters arrived every period, they come of age and they land with the same logistic distribution as we started in the first period. All right, so every 4 years, a new generation of voters arrive with this logistic distribution. All right, what's that dynamic going to look like? Well, as the parties polarize, they drag all their voters with them. All right, and they're moving to the extreme, but all the new voters are landing in the middle, or landing with the logistic distribution, but a lot of them in the middle, and they're going to be too far from the parties to want to vote. They're going to be alienated. Moreover, the base of voters that the parties drag with them are getting older and dying off. Right. Just pure intuition, it makes sense that at some point, this dynamic of the parties polarizing and pulling their base with them, these old Republicans are going to die off, and at some point, it's going to be optimal for that party to start moving back in towards the center. Right. We don't do this analytically, but we want to just sort of point out that this is a richer dynamic and how this tweak to the model seems to be able to explain this sort of a richer cycle of this pattern going on. Because of course, once the base dies out, the parties jump to the middle. The same iterative process that I just described is going to begin again, and they're going to start dragging their bases to the extreme. All right, so we feel like that might be able to capture this cycle of polarization, and this would also rationalize the decreasing turnout, because as you drag your base to the extreme, they're dying off, turnout is going down because most new voters are in the middle and they're not voting. So we think that just adding this rationalizes that, but also gets at this longer dynamic. All right, very good. I'm out of time, so I don't want to go on. I think I've said it several times what we've tried to do with this paper, and I feel like we get at a lot of different touch points with the data. Very simple model, very simple tweak to the voter theory, then just iterated in a standard model of elections, and we show that this sort of generates this back and forth that seems to match the data. All right, that's all we're going for. Very simple story to try to explain several features of the data. There's lots of extensions you can get into, asymmetric points that was asked before, turnout as well. The updating function, we take a particular functional form. This can be enriched in many ways and so on. And then the final point that I bold there is that you can apply it to other systems. If you have multiple parties, what happens there? Because parties can't polarize to hit you run into another party, maybe the dynamics of competition are going to play out very differently, and maybe it can be used to sort of point out there's been polarization in many countries, but not everywhere, and to different degrees, how we might try to rationalize that. But we're not doing any of that today. So I'm out of time. I don't want to hold you up too long. Thanks for coming. If anyone has any questions now, I'm happy to hang out and try to answer them. But of course, everybody else, you are now welcome to depart and do whatever you like.
I do have some questions that I've been holding on.
You know, how rare in you, huh?
Yes. Okay. So let me start with one question, which is one way to see the story of the data that you have is that polarization in a bipartisan, two parties democracy is normality. And that what happened is that at some point, the Democrats and the Republican Party realigned in the middle of the century. And that your model seems to be perfectly consistent with this, in the sense that if I take your model literally, I learn that polarization, or a state of polarization, is the absorbing state of a democracy. But then in some sense, what you're teaching me is that you're not really tackling the interesting question. The interesting question in American politics is why what happened in the middle of the century happened. Okay, so that's one way of asking you this. And the other is, you show me that picture, and I think about Piketty and science and so on, picture about inequality. And my first gut feeling is, well, no wonder. A less unequal society has less polarized political views. You increase inequality again, you get more polarized political views. And so in some sense, isn't that what we've been talking about? At some point, there was a realignment in a moment in which society was less unequal. And that's the interesting thing. The rest is all normality. Is that what you're saying to us?
You got a lot there. So firstly, it's not, the alignment in US politics certainly isn't on income and wealth, like you would think in an unequal society. The Republican base is largely working class, non-college educated whites these days. There's race and there's other issues going on there, but it's not as simple a story as inequality. So first,
I know it is not, but I'm saying, first look at, people don't understand why you want to vote Republican or Democrat, but a more conflictual society polarizes views. Even if voters do not understand why and in which direction, they vote wrongly for Trump.
Well, so let me try to break down your question a little bit and explain it. So firstly, you said the interesting thing is why it moderated in the middle of the century. So I should back up. Point zero is that polarization is a hugely complicated issue. Thousands of people work on it, 1 million theories, and lots of stuff that's relevant that we've just not put in the model. So we're certainly not claiming that here's the answer that you've all been looking for however long. So what we're trying to do is, like theory does, is here's a simple mechanism that we think explains a bunch of stuff. And so, this is the core of the explanation. If you want to add other stuff that adds noise or asymmetry, go for it. But we feel like this is the core. This might be the core of the story. All right. So then your point was the interesting thing is in the middle of the century. So if you look at this data over 100, 150 years, there's these long patterns. If we could sit here today in an hour and give you a theory that explained all of these long patterns, fantastic. All right, what we are saying is, well, let's look at one part of that and see if we can explain that. All right, we're going to just sort of say that's too hard a problem, at least in a model today. Here's this monotonic phase, multiple points of the data, moments of the data. Let us explain that with a super simple mechanism. All right, and that's what we do. We explain the last 50 years. Now, of course, 50 years exists after the previous 50 years. And that's why in the last minute, I wanted to take the time to rush and try to give you a story there. We can't do that in the model as of yet. Right? But I think that's a mistake in sort of, at least in applied theory, to say, well, if it only is in the model, that's all you can do. And what we want to do is just give you a suggestion or a sketch as to how a second, I think, enrichment of the model, a very realistic enrichment, which is births and deaths, might be able to, or at least intuitively, rationalizes the longer cycles of what happens. And that's our approach. I think JC and I would be great if we could do all of that analytically in the one paper and say, here's the monotonic part, and then here how it fits in this. Great, but we're breaking the problem down, and we get that much done.
I guess that the main difference that I expected you in the last slide thing, when you said about what happened in the middle of the century, I expected you to have a supply side rather than a demand side story. So it seems to me that what died and then regenerated is the parties rather than generations of voters. In particular, with what happened in the 60s.
What did you say? The generation of the parties?
Yeah, I mean, it seems
So
to
the
me
realignment of
that realigned. And
the
that's
realignment of parties after civil rights movement. That's sort of the explanation that Gabriele wants to bring forward, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm thinking that what happened is that the parties realigned, and so suddenly voters and parties were not in the same place, and the story that you tell started again.
Yeah, it could be a possibility. I mean, we have thought about this, but this is for another paper, or maybe for another couple of papers. As it is, the paper is long enough and complicated enough.
So that's right. So again, that's certainly a realignment. There was sorting that went on, but then you might say, well, then how do you explain from 1900 to 1950 before that sorting happened? What was the mechanism then? And even after that realignment, I think at a basic level, what you need is a theory of voters. Well, pure sorting is just party labels, but I think the evidence, as I said to John earlier, that the voters' distribution itself has moved around. It's not just a pure relabeling. You need a theory or a model in which voters are changing their ideal point. And we're the first people to do that and stick it in a model. If you want to do that, and so I think that's an important point in its own right, that if you want to explain polarization, it can't be just at the elite level. We've got to add the voters in. And why are the voters updating? Well, here's a mechanism that does it, and we trace it through one way. If you want to trace it through with sorting and other things, go for it. We think that would be great. But I think more broadly, I very much like this sort of flavor of this simple sort of dynamic of interaction of these two players.
And it's empirically grounded, right? So the way so the updating rule that we are using is specific. It's simple, but we don't need exactly that updating rule. All we need is that voters update their ideal points and then move closer to the candidate they voted for, and there is empirical evidence for that.
Mm-hmm. If there's a flourishing literature. Sorry, go on.
A couple of questions, a couple of points about the voters. I mean, the first, which I think cuts somewhat against the story, is the proportion who call themselves moderate hasn't changed very much over a long period. There's been a sort of shift, particularly in the last 20 years, from conservative, a decrease in conservatives and an increase in liberals, which is probably means some conservatives call themselves moderate and some moderates call themselves liberals, and also, of course, generational replacement, because young voters are much more liberal. That's one point. The second is, and it comes to your mechanism, is the rise of registered independents. And so if you're somebody whose ideal position is, say, close to the Republicans, but for one reason, you don't like for example, polarisation, one answer is to say, well, now I'm an independent. I mean, it turns out, very few independents are swinging voters in the sense in which Australians use the term. Most of them are reliable voters for one part or the other, but have chosen to reject the label. And so it'd be good to see, well, the mechanism you described would seem to, there's two things you can do when the party moves. One is to move with it. You're a registered Republican and you move with your leader. The other is to say, well, I'm an independent, so I'm not going to change my views. I'm still going to vote for them because they're closer to my position. So I don't know whether there's any data you could get on that, but it would be interesting to see if you could distinguish independents, and indeed these days they typically ask independents, well, you say you're an independent, but really we know you're a Republican or Democrat.
Yeah.
Which, if you could find whether you could see polarisation, I suspect the place to look for polarisation is in the self-identified, the registered part of the parties, rather than the independent voters who maybe who don't have the same incentive to say, I'm going to shift my views because my party has shifted.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I'd love to be able to do all of that. One hope as a theorist, JC, what we have is that you read the empirical literature and they don't sort of sort out all of those different possibilities. We hope that this sort of gives more clarity or guidance about what they should be looking for in the data. We're not going to do it ourselves, but I think that would be great. And when I read the evidence, I see traces of that, but that might just be my motivated reasoning. I think you started by talking also about the legislative independence and the parties.
No,
you meant the voter independence. Yeah, I didn't quite.
People who are registered as independents, which of course is something unique to the US that you can declare.
So certainly the Abramovich view of the moderates who haven't moved is that these are the people who are disaffected from politics. In our model, these are this clump. Our interpretation of that would be that this is the clump of abstainers who have just always abstained and never been connected to politics. And maybe there's a scattering of noise voters in there who sometimes they vote, but that's really just noise. And the fact that people seem to agree upon is that it's the more engaged in politics are the ones who are polarizing, and the less engaged are not polarizing. And so we take that to be like, you're voting, you're engaged. That's the ones who are moving out.
It's just touching on one more thing, which is this is a unilinear story, but of course there's multiple dimensions. And one of the things you see, I think, in a period of heightened political activity is that a lot of people tend to adjust their views on second order issues in line with the party preference, which if you then map them on back, if you then squeeze the thing onto right to left, you have people who maybe haven't become, you see, I saw this discussion with Democrats, activist Democrats haven't necessarily become particularly left-wing on any one issue. All they've done is drop the issues where they, on the issues where they deviated, they now realise, look, Democrats don't think this way about the Confederate flag, or don't think this way about
that's right. So
vaccination.
The evidence, there's a lot of the people right in the middle are not that they've got centrist views on everything. It's that they've got polarized views on everything, but half are left, half and right.
Exactly.
And so another big debate in political science is that, are they real preferences? Is one dimension really? Because voters, you alluded to this in your previous question, voters really are honest or don't even know what they're doing themselves. That's still up in the air, but my reading of it, and I think the majority view is that it's really a single dimensional thing, captures most of it, other than race. Race is the one thing that sort of kicks out of that. But anyway, very good.
And Anton, you have one more question before we adjourn?
Sure, yes. Thank you very much for the talk. I very much enjoyed it. So it seems that one key driving force is that ideal points of political parties are more polarized than voters on average. And then like with time, voters go to these polarized ideal points of parties. So I know that it's hard to measure where ideal points lie because it's not empirically observable, but is there some evidence that ideal points of the parties are more polarized than voters on average?
Yeah, so we take it as given that the party positions of ideal points are fixed, and I sort of flagged that a little bit when we did it. I think our ideal, and so they start with these really extreme preferences. taking the model literally 50 years ago, the Republicans' ideal point were exactly super extreme, and they just had moderate positions. Our sort of ideal model would be to endogenize that as well and have some sort of party ideal point as some amalgamation of the party membership. And what we do know is the party membership is more polarized than the voting base itself. And so if you just said the party position is a function of the leadership or the more engaged members, that would be enough, because that would be more extreme than the voters themselves. And I imagine there'd be an iterative process with, as the voters polarize, the party leadership becomes more polarized and it reinforces itself. And there are some sort of somewhat related models in the literature of organizations that have a similar sort of flavor. So we step away from all of that and just assume that the parties have these extreme positions and that they're always trying to move towards that. It certainly seems to be the case that the leadership is more, as I said, is more polarized than the voters. And so I skipped over that slide, but the distribution of voters ends up being on the inside of the party position. And so we think that matches that fact as well, that the elites in our model is a single point, but you know, the elites versus the more day-to-day voters is going to have that structure. It has it empirically, and it should come out of the model because it's the voters are chasing the elites.
Thanks.
Yeah, so like I think a source of a bunch of the empirical questions, we bite off a lot here. Polarization is a huge issue. There's voters, there's parties, there's sort of the rich history of many other parties and realignment and all sorts of stuff. And we offer a very simple mechanism. So the style of paper is very much, here's a very simple mechanism that seems to match a bunch of the important facts. Clearly, it doesn't explain everything, but we feel like there's some sort of simple truth to this iterative mechanism we identify, and we feel like it's going to explain a bunch. There's clearly going to be a bunch of stuff that it doesn't fit and that it doesn't include, but you know, our hope is that that makes a good theory paper, and that's what our feeling is.
Okay, so it's past a quarter, so let me thank Steve, who now will enjoy how many beers, Anton?
I wish I was there to have a beer with you all.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. Hopefully later, maybe next year, when things go back to the new normal, as people say. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for everyone. Next week is the last seminar of this part of the year with Simon Lurcher. Okay. Bye bye all. Thanks, Steve, again.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you.